Hi, welcome to Archimarathon. Kevin f***ed up the audio on the last one. We're recording this the second time, which is fun. Today we're talking about the age-old debate of architecture versus building. Is there a difference? Where do you draw the line? Roll the intro. I've been called a communist so much lately with all of the mask wearing. Like, I've been hanging out with people like Pablo who are just saying, "Oh, this is just a dictatorship and my rights are being oppressed." And I'm like, what? We live in this horrible age where individual freedoms, instead of the beautifully complex notion of our freedoms as a society, as a collection of people, how do we protect each other's freedoms? And that's all been people don't seem to understand the nuance of that versus, what about my freedom? Well, you're a white middle class person. You've got the most privilege in the world. Shut the up and wear the mask.
Do you often have to explain to people what architecture is versus just any other building?
No.
Do you?
But I think that's probably the generation that we have now. And it's probably also Melbourne as well. People that just kind of understand.
Well, maybe just because your clients sort of gravitate towards you, they already kind of know what kind of it's about.
Yeah.
But, you come across a lot of people, certainly I do, come across a lot of people, you kind of explain to them, they kind of look at anything and go, that's architecture over there. It's like, not really.
No, well, I guess I do.
Draw the line?
My family in Tassie, my sort of broader family, so ever since I studied architecture, it was like, why did you do that? What the hell does an architect do? And I would just go, I don't know, bye. Just couldn't be bothered, because you just tell they didn't actually want to have a discussion about what is architecture, what differentiates it, if anything, from building. They really just wanted to call me a wanker. And I couldn't argue. They were right. I was a wanker.
Yeah, they are right. Yes.
Architecture versus building. Is there a difference? I don't think there is. I don't know how you draw the line. My line would be, I would position it this way, that all buildings are architecture of varying levels of success. And not all buildings need an architect to be architecture. But not all architecture is buildings, because there's also really great paper architecture, really great sort of ideas. Will Alsop used to say sometimes the best solution is no building at all. Quite like that notion that architecture can be something beyond just the material.
Yeah, and then there's also computer games and all those virtual environments.
The best architecture I've been to is in video games, I'd say. Controversial.
Yes, but what's interesting also is the idea of architecture is really about the conversation about space, and that's what that is. But there's also the difference between paper architecture that I think we are referring to. We're talking about people like Livius Woods, early OMA, Rem Koolhaas, early Zaha Hadid, Peter Eisman, and all those, they're paper architecture, but they're challenging ideas. They're challenging, even Archigram, and even before that, even Le Corbusier, they were challenging ideas about certain political, social, cultural agenda, as opposed to a lot of the paper architecture now in a lot of the archiporn that you get, beautiful renders of stuff.
Yeah.
They're just stuff. They're not really challenging any notions.
I guess it requires a definition of what paper architecture is. Like, being educated in the 90s, it had sort of it was known as something that was culturally, socially, and especially politically polemical. So things that you couldn't get away with, because if you build something, you have to operate within the status quo. There's so much conservatism, control, and health and safety and building codes, all these very important things that means you get your politics gets pushed into the status quo. And paper architecture, this idea that you could experiment with fictions that are really close to the bone, satire. There was a definition for that, where you just see people just rendering fake buildings for no apparent reason other than just getting more likes, like, comment, subscribe. I wouldn't define that as paper architecture.
So I think a good way that I use to explain to people, including students, about architecture. I mean, it takes 5 years in architecture school to get to trying to understand what is good architecture. I mean, I think we established that. I think all buildings are architectural of varying qualities, but how do you actually know what is actually good architecture? And this is kind of what we refer to as architecture, that is actually of certain quality. And one way I try to explain it, as I love my food analogy, is cooking. A lot of architects actually love cooking. I know you don't like cooking much, but a lot of them do. I think we ran a poll many years ago when the forum they used to run. I think more than 85% of architects love cooking. And I think there's similarity to cooking and the culinary arts, because it is about making ordinary materials, where be it ingredients or the term materials. So you can go to the market and buy all kinds of raw ingredients for cooking, just like you do with steel, concrete, glass. It's raw materials, and it's actually how you put it together to make it a special meal, some special experience, more than just it's edible. And I think a lot of buildings are just kind of, it's a building, it shelters, it has walls, it's not going to fall down, but they are just merely edible. So why do people pay good money to go to a restaurant, go to have this experience that sometimes they remember for the rest of their lives for this experience? And I think that's where architecture is. It's more than some of its parts. It's something a lot more playful, a lot more. It deals with all your senses and memory and all those amazing things. Have you seen Ratatouille?
Yeah.
That's the Disney
Pixar movie.
Pixar, sorry, it's the Pixar movie where the rat is the chef. My favorite scene is the scene where the rat cooks for this revered restaurant critic. And what he cooked was a simple ratatouille meal. It's this kind of humble, simple dish. But when he took a bite, suddenly it flashes back to his childhood and his amazing memory, it's tears to his eyes. And I think that's what architecture can do. It doesn't mean that the more expensive the material, I can use all this expensive, fancy stuff and very difficult to make. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be better architecture. And I think a lot of people think, the more money I spent, the better it is. But sometimes it's actually a solution that is a lot simpler. And, there's nothing wrong with a very, very good potato dish. Oh, there you go. The audio's dead. The audio's dead. The audio's gone. Can't hear you.
This is already on.
You should have just used those straight away.
But a very special friend gave me these.
Yeah.
Kevin gave me these. I was so touched when he gave them to me. He's like, here, have some AirPods. And then, funk, had to f it up. Andrew's AirPods.
We're having serious audio issues in this episode.
Architecture versus building versus audio.
So architecture school, I think that's quite an interesting idea. It takes 5 years to go through architecture school. And in the meantime, hopefully, students will learn, or at least get an idea of what is architecture, and more importantly, to learn what they really don't know. But what's interesting is that after that, the registration, the extra work they do, is not really on the art of architecture itself, then it is actually about legal issues and procurement.
Competency.
That competency in the procurement of a building rather than architecture and the way that quality that we're talking about. So the real conversation and the education of that really stops officially at the end of university. And then they got a whole career in front of them. So, and the good ones, and the top of the game, they as you said, a lot of architects go to Venice Biennale, they go to conferences, they go to visit and travel to see buildings, because it's a continuation of that education about architecture. Whereas, and that's so important, where that doesn't happen a lot for everyone.
Yeah, and it's about the question why. We've addressed that a couple of times in our videos. Why do you do these things? And every project, why are you doing it? And going and traveling and going to conferences and visiting things. It's a way of pulling your head up out of doing your work, because you find that the longer you sit at the drawing table just churning through projects, the more that you can get in a mindset of just assembling building parts instead of being objective and going, what is the bigger picture here? What's my position culturally, socially, and politically? And in that lies a clear difference between architecture and building. You know, a lot of people, when they come to an architect, you will hear people talking about components of buildings. You know, I want these components or these parts or these functions within my building. It's great. We need that. We need the shopping list of what needs to be in there. But most architects will actually try to dislocate some of the language away from the spaces away from the spaces that are to be created. As you said, architecture is about defining space. So things like a door and a window and a roof and a wall, they all have connotations that we see immediately. And I'm a pretty simple creature, so I will see a standard sized door, I will see a sash window, I will see a suburban roof, and I'll see brick walls, like just by those definitions. And as an architect, what you need to do is sort of take those definitions away to kind of get to the essence of what somebody's asking for or what the opportunities are for a certain site. So many architects try to work beyond those definitions to free themselves, to liberate themselves from what you just buy from the shop to install. So one being architecture, the creation of delightful space, versus the assemblage of building components.
Which you have to do, but it's
Absolutely
not the focus. And I think that's the problem with things like BIM software, which is building information management software, where you do put in the computer these elements, and you are thinking about windows and doors and things. You know, it's about building these things with these things, as opposed to a much bigger conceptual understanding and ideation level of the spaces and the composition and the order of the project and what it means and what it does.
And it's about making sure
assembling a building.
Yeah, and it's about making sure that you don't miss opportunities. So at the end of the day, we're always battling budgets. So the best way to bring a budget down is to not design something bespoke, is to use commonly found objects. But you can't start from that premise. You need to, I always call it, getting lost in the fog of war. You need to sort of head off with your architectural weaponry, your pens and your papers, and pursue all of these most likely dead ends to see what the best opportunity is for that particular project. You can't start with the componentry, but then when you come back to it, you go, okay, now how do I build this thing? A beautiful word is buildability. I love that word, and it's a word that's probably not taught enough in university. So you've gone to explore these amazing ideas. Now let's assess it in terms of buildability, and that would bring you back to the area of components. That'll bring you back to bricks and tiles, which again, our generation is using a lot of these known elements. But they're not limiting. They're just a way of assembling these spaces that we've imagined for this particular site.
So what's the main thing? Yeah,
exactly.
That episode up above Andrew's head. Yeah, the main thing. Because it's so easy to lose track of the bigger idea when it gets to all that.
And so something like BIM is a wonderful tool to keep the process on track and to rationalize things. If you start with BIM, though, you're probably going to start just assembling components and not really thinking about what is the nature of this space, what is the quality, what are the opportunities, where's the architecture, where's the joy. You're not really thinking about humans. You're thinking about just building materials.
Yeah, I think the very fact of thinking about space, it's that is probably the biggest gift of modernism when it started in the early 20th century. The dialogue becomes about space. It's not about style, although some people see that as a style, but it really was a liberation of building that can do certain things, and it's about the spaces, and the conversations about spaces. It's about the order that things are composed and what it means. And there's so many different options of how that can come together now. So, going back to the idea of architecture and education, and the fact that there is a long process to be a registered architect. In some countries, you require to be a registered architect to procure certain type of buildings, which is great. But having an architecture degree or, being a registered architect makes architecture. It's a bit like the same argument as Marcel Duchamp. I'm an artist, therefore whatever I do is art.
Yeah. No, look, you don't. Architecture doesn't need to be created by an architect, but it bloody helps. But there are rare. I know you're going to talk about Tato Ando. There are rare examples where there are incredible architecture that had no architect involved. However, I think the safest bet is to use an architect. It's like going and getting, heart surgery. Like talking about architecture versus building, talking about surgery versus cutting open a body. Anybody can go build a building. Yeah, sure. Anybody can. Do surgery on their liver. It's about the level of success, I guess, and who do you trust to do that? So having an architect is the safest way to help that you have great quality buildings. However, there's great examples of architecture being made without architects, and there's also a lot of architects that don't care. They're just producing buildings. They're just fulfilling a brief and.
But it also goes both ways too, having clients who are a little bit more aware of architecture and therefore having the kind of conversation that would actually which is more than just procuring a building instead of just give me a building. Therefore, that would that would entice, I guess, architects to have a bit more care about the kind of architecture they're producing, potentially.
Yeah. No, absolutely. An engaged client who is considering much more than just return on investment, the size of their building, the level of bling that's in it, but actually give a shit about the longevity, the sustainability, the quality of their life now and into the future. You're going to have a much more engaged, interesting conversation and a better outcome than just maximizing yield on a site. All right, so architecture versus building. Is there a difference? What do you think? Can you leave a comment? Tell us what you think. Can anybody make architecture? Is anything that's built architecture in some way?
Do you care?
Do you give a shit? Why the hell are you watching? As always, please like, comment, subscribe. We really appreciate it. Go to Patreon and have a look there. There's a lot of really good discussions there. There's lots of really interesting things that Kevin says that I tell him to cut out of the YouTube stuff because he looks better than I do and sounds better than I do. So that's all on Patreon. All right, guys, thanks for watching. We love you all. Talk to you soon.